are there anomalous objects in the sky? So you can rely on the government to declassify information, but the sky isn't classified. With the right people, the right skills, you can just go out and actually demonstrate that this is a real phenomenon. If there are anomalous objects out there of non-human origin, well, that is a highly valuable hint at new physics. And if it turns out that there's a deep connection between human consciousness and those objects, well, that also is highly suggestive direction to explore, to understand the nature of consciousness. So these are the two most fundamental questions about reality that humans have at the moment.
So the government's admitting that we have the ability to manipulate space and time. And Skywatcher's out there trying to summon UAPs. What the hell is going on?
You just fell to the wrong timeline, my friend. Or the right one, depending on your perspective.
Was that admission by the Trump administration this week part of disclosure? Light disclosure? What are we classifying that as?
I mean, my thesis for some time has been the government will adopt an attitude, I think more out of necessity and constraint, of what I would call as if disclosure, meaning they will increasingly be acting as if this subject is true without ever really, or at least not immediately, confirming or affirming it's true. So you have episodes like that speech, which, Kratsios is the head of Office of Science and Technology Policy. He was formerly basically the head of all advanced research inside the Defense Department, including DARPA, as well as other, our most highly classified, highly sensitive research projects in the Pentagon. There's a metaphorical interpretation of that language. Some folks thought it was alluding to technologies that close the gap for human civilization across space and time, technologies that accelerate transportation, communications, etc., which is a fair interpretation, I think, of his first phrase. But the second use of that term was at the very end, where he basically said, give themselves, encouraging people to give themselves into scientific discoveries that manipulate space and time. The internet is not a scientific discovery. Again, the nature of such statements is they're plausibly ambiguous, right? They don't really tell you, and you just kind of have a Rorschach test, and folks that see the message there get a little bit of a wink out of it. Other folks see it as just a bunch of noise, and we're kind of left talking like we're talking.
The Malaysian Airlines people are all over this.
Yeah. I mean, that whole thing is mostly, I think, a grift that's been spun up around a cult-like leader. So I tend not to engage with that.
The orbs did not teleport the plane into another dimension or somewhere else on Earth.
I mean, there are likely orbs. Those are real things. But I think that particular event has been spun up by bad faith actors looking to basically manipulate a community of people and collect their Patreon donations. So there's lots of other crazy conspiracies and very interesting topics that I think have, as Skywatcher, I can talk about lots of crazy stuff. And so it's interesting where I draw the line. I just see that as a bit of noise.
You're saying I should have that guy on the podcast? I've had a bunch of people reach out to me this week. You got to get him on, Marty.
I mean, you do what you want to do with your podcast. But I have my opinion.
Yeah. It is crazy. Do you think if it was the nonchalant disclosure, I forget how you worded it specifically, but this as if matter of fact, could it be light signaling toward China while we're having this geopolitical boxing match with tariffs, sort of like a light message? Hey, China, yes, we're in this trade war, but we also have some technology that you may not be aware of that we could leverage if you get too far into this trade war.
Yeah, I mean, you can take that as a speculative hypothesis, and one data point, in that direction is what Trump said in the Oval Office when he was interviewed by a bunch of folks shortly after the tariff war kicked off, talking about essentially, he's riffing on lots of stuff, but he basically mentioned his sense of confidence in our defense and our weapons capabilities. and made statements to the effect that we have weapons that are so much stronger. Nobody has any idea how they work, right? They're stronger than anyone has on on Earth, and they're so strong, they're so powerful. Nobody even understands how they work. And he's, I think, pointing that to China is like, we got some stuff up our sleeve. Don't think about it. And then I think in the context of this larger geoeconomic reordering and geopolitical kind of confrontation, you could say, is underway. That's across all these different dimensions of the global system, the trade system, the financial system, and then these more deep-seated structures of power, right? Like telecommunication systems, space, and ultimately, deterrence on military basis. And so this is a lot of posturing, a lot of rhetoric, a lot of subtle signaling. And there's a larger strategic objective by at least the more, I'd say, long range oriented elements of the Trump administration to try to re-anchor a system with the U.S. at the center to kind of hold the line against a ambitious sinosphere across all these different domains. And but the hegemon has some weaknesses, has some strategic vulnerabilities, treasury markets, a sense that we are decaying global power in some parts of the world. So they want to kind of, again, make America great again, right? They want to restore a sense of America as the industrial and technological leader of the civilization, and to extend and define a much more explicit zone for other countries to sort of submit to basic American leadership. So essentially a tech, tariff, and security zone. So you need to have kind of carrots and sticks if you want to do that, right? And so you want to look at all the different cupboards and drawers of where you might have some carrots and sticks to try to wield in this high stakes negotiation, try to pull countries into your orbit. And so it probably, is a delicate balancing act to sort of subtly hint at, not just to China, but to other countries around the world. Do we have some aces up our sleeve, right? That maybe the world isn't counting into the overall balance of leverage, right? Ultimately, everyone's looking around and saying, okay, if I had to boil it down, it's a lot more complicated. It's essentially the U.S. is trying to force countries to pick a side, right? To get off the fence, to not kind of try to be balancing powers, but to more overtly commit to U.S. Alignment and away from, entanglements, trade, cooperation, et cetera, with China. And so you have to kind of make it look like you still got it, right? You got to kind of hint that you still have the juice to run the global system, or at least provide a credible protection as well as, enticement that there's some goodies down the line if you align with the U.S. And if you don't align with the U.S., maybe you will get less privileged access to those goodies that could be coming down the line. So I think this is part of this larger game. So that's why I think this topic isn't irrelevant. In fact, it's very critically relevant to these larger geopolitical and geoeconomic shakeups. Because ultimately, if you assume that this is true, folks don't have to assume that it's true. But if you do, something like this plot that we've talked about before, then it's going to be top of mind, or at least in the back of everyone's mind, especially at these at the high table of geopolitical bargaining, right? Like Russia knows that we know that they know, China knows that we know that they know, et cetera. And so when you're thinking about how people are positioning and bluffing or not, when they allude to who's got the most strategic resilience or aces up their sleeve, this has got to be, very, very much relevant.
And so let's dive into the potential of an ace actually being up our sleeve for the people who may be skeptical out there who witnessed that matter of fact admission and just thought it was noise. Like I mentioned earlier, you've been doing work at Skywatcher, and I just want to pull up, I'm going to read from my notes here about what your team is working on. I was with somebody last week who was describing it to me. I was like, what the heck is Matt and his team up to? What are you doing? What are you doing? So your team is testing two main hypotheses for UAP interaction: electromechanical signaling, using tailored electronic signals to attract UAPs, and neuro-meditative interaction, the role of human consciousness. what is it, and what have been the most surprising findings that you guys have discovered using these methods?
Yeah, so my career's taken an interesting turn, right? So after doing years of more government national security consulting and geopolitical risk cyber consulting, and then taking on the executive director position at Bitcoin Policy Institute, where obviously our mission is extremely high tempo to try to decisively shift America in a pro-Bitcoin direction and translate that into concrete policy action. I also kind of dipped my foot more professionally in the UAP water. So I become a strategic advisor to this firm called Skywatcher, which is essentially a organization dedicated to collecting highly rigorous information related to anomalous phenomenon in the sky, to perform rigorous data analysis and scientific assessment of that information, and then to communicate results publicly to try to resolve this fundamental question, right? Are there anomalous objects in the sky? And it's essentially, there's two paths to coming up to an answer to that question. You can rely on the government to declassify information or to make statements, official statements or issue reports on that subject, in which case you're still essentially trusting the government, in what it says. But the sky isn't classified, right? And so if there is a reality to this phenomenon, right, with the right people, the right skills, the right capabilities, you could just go out and do things, right? And actually demonstrate to a higher degree of satisfaction by, peers in the scientific community and more broadly, that this is a real phenomenon. And that seemed like a more fanciful possibility until folks, started to ask that question to themselves, folks that had relevant backgrounds and skills and resources, and decided to basically assemble, this team, which is what Skywatcher is. Folks that have highly relevant information and knowledge about these sorts of topics, have come from related government associated activities, and bring their technical skills to bear to actually go out and try to collect this data and share that in a deliberate fashion with the public and the broader scientific community. And so there's kind of two core questions, right? That we released this document called the Skywatcher Discovery Framework. Again, kind of this anchor point. This isn't about a fanciful, kind of a Skinwalker Ranch type of sort of media operation. It's like, okay, how do we seriously collect data on this question and put resources to that task? And basically, it's principal objective is to validate this idea that there are anomalous objects in the sky. Anomalous meaning, in terms of their performance characteristics, in terms of their apparent morphologies. Now, answering that question doesn't answer the origin question, right? It just says there are some things in the sky that are doing things that normal objects don't do. And so you need to have multiple sensors, different types of sensors. You need to do this repeatedly. You need to do it in a rigorous fashion. You need to have consistent data collection. We're talking radar, electro-optical, multiple bands of infrared, direction finding, with lasers to get distance, multiple human observation. And this effort is obviously, maturing and expanding. So there might be more types of sensors coming down the line, and additional capabilities, brought to bear to help, tighten up the type of analysis that can be done. That's basically the core question. And so there are certain techniques that are being applied in the field. Because if you just took these sensors out into any random location, maybe you'll see some stuff, right? There's other efforts out there to try to just have a good and consistent data collection to sort of point sensors at the sky and try to see what you can see. The folks at Skywatcher have a well-motivated hypothesis that there's a way of essentially improving the odds that you see something. And there's two methods that we have hypothesized are ways of improving the odds that anomalous phenomena will appear near your sensors. The first is, colloquially called this dog whistle, a certain way of essentially sending out signals, electronic mechanical related signals that will attract UAPs to your location. They have a reason to believe that that's effective, but of course, we want to prove it. We want to demonstrate to a certain degree of statistical reliability that it is, in fact, doing what we think it's doing. And then the second is neuro-meditative techniques, right? So certain individuals engaging in a certain state of consciousness result in similar phenomenon appearing in your location. And we assess kind of at our preliminary stage right now, and we've written that into that report. That's different levels of confidence, right? Different levels of kind of discovery, sort of where we would sort of set the marker for where we think these hypotheses stand, is moving from anecdata, right? Anecdotes, blurry cell phone videos, people with claims and first person experiences. That's where most of the conversation is, right? It's somewhat inchoate, sometimes very compelling, but fundamentally ad hoc, inconsistent, not sort of to a scientific level of rigor. And so we want to move from that to standardized data collection. And that's kind of the core of this whole operation, is just being consistent, being standardized, being rigorous, being professional, using high-end equipment and practices to actually try to collect good data and then generate hypotheses that you can test, that you can look through and try to demonstrate with a certain degree of confidence resolves to ruling out confounding potential explanations, birds, balloons, etc. But ultimately isolates down to a high degree of confidence that there's a truly anomalous phenomena. And then you can share that publicly and hopefully move the conversation forward. So I wouldn't say we claim that these two techniques are proven, but we have reason to believe that they could be effective. And we want to now, if you can prove those two things, those would be kind of a big deal. And so, it's an exceptionally ambitious project, I would say, right? Maybe absurdly ambitious. But the folks involved, I wouldn't have associated myself with it if I didn't think that if there was a group out there that, could credibly take a good crack at it, this would be the group, right? I've sort of taken a bunch of swings at these low probability, high impact, activities in the past, and I don't know. I have a hunch on this one.
Listen, freaks, I know you're tired of me talking about Fold, but I'm going to beat the drum. I'm going to beat the dead horse. If you're a Bitcoiner living in the United States and you're not using Fold, I'm just going to ask one question. What are you doing? You're leaving sats on the table. They've got gift cards. They've got their debit card. You can use your credit card. Just connect your credit card to the Fold app. Use the Fold app to pay off your credit card, and you're going to stack your credit card points and Bitcoin as well. They even teamed up with Crowd Health to give their members Fold Plus membership at no cost. Don't leave sats on the table. Go sign up for Fold today. Go to tftc.io/fold. There's nothing to lose except sats that you could have stacked. Sup, freaks? This rip of TFTC was brought to you by our good friends at Bitkey. Bitkey makes Bitcoin easy to use and hard to lose. It is a hardware wallet that natively embeds into a 2 or 3 multi-sig. You have one key on the hardware wallet, one key on your mobile device, and Block stores a key in the cloud for you. This is an incredible hardware device for your friends and family, or maybe yourself, who have Bitcoin on exchanges and have for a long time, but haven't taken the step to self-custody because they're worried about the complications of setting up a private public key pair, securing that seed phrase, setting up a PIN, setting up a passphrase. Again, Bitkey makes it easy to use, hard to lose. It's the easiest 0 to 1 step, your first step to self-custody. If you have friends and family on the exchanges who haven't moved it off, tell them to pick up a Bitkey. Go to bitkey.world, use the key TFTC20 at checkout for 20% off your order. That's bitkey.world, code TFTC20. All right, let's dive further into this. Like how, like the neuro-meditative and the signaling, technology behind the signaling and the theory or the practice behind the neuro-meditative part of it. And then the data collection. Is it simply observational data? Like we do something and something appears, or is there something else you're measuring in the electromagnetic field or some other sort of measurement that you're taking?
Yes. So the data collection piece is continuing to refine and expand, right? There's always lots of different things you can try to measure, right? They've only really done 3 operations so far, right? So the basic SOP is essentially doing these events, multi-day events out in the desert, essentially, an isolated location. And you have, large numbers of people with equipment out in different, locations, executing these sort of test events, essentially. And so you want to place the sensors, and you want to basically observe what happens over multiple days and try to demonstrate or build up at least an evidence base over time of what you can detect on multiple sensors. And so, yeah, the principal sensors are, radar, electro-optical, so, fancy cameras, multiple bands of infrared, multiple human observers, both in ground as well as aerial platforms, so helicopters, and laser rangefinders, right? So you can see if the object has is in a certain distance away from you. And so the objective with just that core sensor package is to try to get multiple correlations on an object to understand, okay, like how far is it away? How high is it? How fast is it moving? What are its what's its radar cross section? What are its sort of signatures when it bounces back from the radar? You can tell some things about the object just based off of kind of the return profile, kind of the heartbeat of the object from the radar. But there's other things you could put out there, right? In terms of magnetometers, other sort of detections along parts of the electromagnetic spectrum, radio frequency detection. So there's lots of things you could try to put out there. I mean, the more sensors you add, the more data you've got to analyze and cross correlate, so it just becomes, a larger operation. And so I think the objective is to be deliberate about bringing more sensors in. I'm not, I'm just an advisor. I'm not running these operations, but yeah, I mean, that's basically what you have to do here. If you want to try to rule out, okay, you see something on a video and you're like, okay, that looks weird, right? But okay, weird is weird, right? Weird could be a plane at an odd angle or a balloon floating across the screen, right? But if it's moving against the wind at a consistent velocity, okay, it's probably not a balloon, right? Well, what could it be? Could it be a weird drone? Okay, well, you have a reference class of video of what a drone looks like at a certain distance, and you can get a laser rangefinder on this object, that's not, it's at the same approximate distance, and that it's not a drone, right? So it's about eliminating possible explanations to ultimately get down to something. This is not something prosaic, and then you have to try to determine what it is. And so in the most recent release, Skywatcher put out, basically, described at a very high level kind of 9 categories of UAP that had been observed. Again, not like a final classification of what their origin is or exactly what they are, just essentially purely like phenomenological. Like there's a certain thing that we've seen that we'll just come up with a name for that thing. And I think we're going to come up with more information about each of those in the coming few weeks and months. But yeah, so you can watch those videos and see how this is all described. But yeah, so this is ultimately it's like, okay, can you do real science with this? And real science is hard. You have to be patient. And one of the things that attracted me to this whole thing was that the UAP thing is either you're actually behind the circle, in which case you're not talking about it, or you're on podcasts and it's just pretty people's stories, right? Or that's somebody's random video on YouTube or Twitter. And that's basically, like sort of round and round we go, right? And I feel like somebody has to kind of try to move the ball down the field, and it takes effort, takes time and money, and it's so I'm like, hey, I really want someone to try to answer this question in a way that's transparent to the public. So just go do it.
Our good friends Parker Lewis and Drew Bonsall are two of the deepest thinkers in Bitcoin. While they come from very different backgrounds, they've landed on the exact same conclusion. It's Bitcoin that matters, not crypto. This masterclass lays out why 21 million is the key breakthrough, how Bitcoin, not blockchain, creates decentralization, and why everything else will be built on Bitcoin. Understand why Bitcoin works and why nothing else does. Watch the premiere at unchained.com/TFTC. That's unchained.com/TFTC. In terms of inciting UAPs to appear, is that dependent on the technology? And I don't even know how to describe the neuro-meditative part of it. Should I like to dive in there? Or is it the location? Because you read stuff, you watch documentaries, and they talk about particular places on the planet where certain things happen. The pyramids may be where they are because of this. Tesla was in Colorado because it was optimal to do what he was trying to do with his Tesla coils. Is there something about these specific locations, or is it more dependent on the technology you're using to signal to incite an appearance, or a combination of the two?
Well, separate from Skywatcher, I've observed just in kind of like the semi-official historical record, right? Coming from ERA, for example, they've put out maps that show hotspots. Obviously, there's kind of a lot of confounding biases there because they're sort of detecting where their sensors are. So there's I think a lot of noise in that. There also have been, semi-credible, repeatable kind of reports of consistent observations in certain parts of the world, certain, sort of maritime littoral areas, certain areas of the U.S. And there's a plausibility to that, right? But it's very hard to, that I don't think it's much bit of a systematic analysis, right? Maybe the U.S. government, with a lot of global sensor collection, has identified and pinpointed certain hotspots, and maybe people, in the know, kind of subtly act on that knowledge when they do things, or they go to look for certain locations. For Skywatcher, I don't know if that's motivated any particular locations. I think it's a lot of it's just, operational flexibility, right? Like you need to have a large space that you can operate in, that's secure, that's relatively remote and doesn't have as has little clutter in the air as possible. Because Skywatcher's not the military. We can't just like roll up and just sort of do stuff. We're gonna have like a military base where we have hundreds of square miles to sort of freely operate in. So I think given those constraints, like we're trying to pick a location. But I think it's my understanding is that again, we're dealing with a lot of uncontrolled variables here, but the dog whistle, right, is apparently effective, wherever you put it, right? But maybe you only can get a good high fidelity observation if you turn it on in a relatively uncluttered area, right? If you turn it on in the middle of New York City, right? Like, I'm not sure, like what would happen if it would people discern what's happening with all the other stuff going on. So yeah, I think that's that. Now, like the specifics of the electronic kind of methods, the specific frequencies or modulations or whatever, I don't know it. I kind of don't want to know it, right? I think that's information that's should be closely held until you have a better understanding of the phenomenon that you could be triggering. So I think it's a matter of discretion to assess that. And then the neuro-meditative stuff is obviously the most like evocative and challenging to, I think, baseline worldviews about the nature of human consciousness or consciousness in general. It's becoming increasingly relevant to this larger issue.
And I think more socially acceptable, particularly with something like the telepathy tapes becoming popular. Very big right now.
Mm-hmm.
Says this is what is happening. Skywatcher is taking a bunch of autistic people to the desert, and they're
not autistic as well. I mean, I don't know.
Okay.
I haven't diagnosed them.
I'm being a bit facetious here,
but and I think there'll be more information about the psionics piece or the neuro-meditative operators piece in the next release. So I don't want to like jump ahead of that. At least I was out there and I talked with some of these folks, and they're normal people, or they're not the sort of autistic children in the telepathy tapes thing. They're just individuals that have claimed to had certain experiences and also have developed certain practices that allow them to engage consciously with craft, or at least to have the perception that they are, and then have craft appear. That in our assessment right now is like very, very, very preliminary, right? We have reason to believe by other sources that this could be relevant, but like as far as we've been able to demonstrate out in the field, we haven't, conclusively demonstrated that that's a thing. But we have enough, of a basis to try to demonstrate it, right? And try to collect scientific data along the way, right? Which is a hard thing to do, with a dog whistle, right? It's an electronic signal. You can turn it on, turn it off. And if you have a large enough sample set, you essentially try to just get the correlations and the t-tests down to a point where you can say, we have highly dispositive confirmation of an anomalous object, and it happens to correlate with a certain degree of statistical confidence when the dog whistle's on. It's harder to do that, in a field setting with the neuro-meditative operators, right? But not impossible. So ultimately, it's like taking these questions from the realm of metaphysical speculation and kind of wooey, implication to just like, okay, the world could be such a way. How can we do something to try to indicate whether it is that way? And sort of shake off whatever priors like you have, right? A lot of people have like a folk metaphysics or a folk physics in their heads, and they just assume the world is a certain way. I did physics and philosophy. I had to, I wanted to understand like what is the way the world is, right? And the way the world is from the perspective of Isaac Newton, developed a certain set of models, a certain set of ontologies that were quite successful for his time at trying to understand the world and then develop technologies to exploit that knowledge. And the history of scientific revolutions has always been one of changing the fundamental paradigm of science over long periods of time that ultimately end up shifting the core kind of metaphysical assumptions that humanity has about the nature of reality. And so we happen to be in the first quarter of the 21st century with a certain set of metaphysical models and physical models of the world. And the lesson of history is that those are likely to change. And the other lesson of history is that physics is not just this sort of ivory tower practiced by a bunch of eggheads at universities. It's a core function of governments to secure national strategic advantage. Like the lesson, even World War I, there was a lesson of the application of chemistry, right, for gas weapons and high explosives. And then there was the dramatic exploitation of physics in the 30s to develop nuclear weapons. And I don't think that lesson was lost on national governments, that physics research is the foundation of national power, and that it is the key that unlocks the next strategic breakthrough in both energy, weapons, and propulsion technology. So my basic thesis is I don't think open physics was really allowed to happen after 1945. So part of this is, okay, there's a certain part of the world, a certain knowledge about the world that has maybe been intentionally kept secret, maybe for good reason. Maybe there's some knowledge that's inherently dangerous knowledge, but I think that's a reasonable proposition. But it's a difficult question. So I think generally speaking, folks think they know what the world is and how it works, and I think people's level of confidence in those assumptions is way too high. And so that's why I think these questions are ultimately, scientific questions. They're not questions of, wooey speculation or podcast. They're like, go out, get the data, show me that there's an anomaly there that my present models can't account for. And usually scientific paradigms shift when you have an accretion of anomalies, right? There's a certain consensus that's baked in about a certain set of frameworks or scientific explanations. And then interesting experiments happen or observations happen that are, not easily explained by that central, consensus paradigm. But the paradigm doesn't just automatically, take that in. Usually it rejects it. Usually it says, no, it's not possible. It rules it out prima facie. Telepathy is not possible. Remote viewing is not possible. Consciousness is just a emergent phenomenon of neurobiological and chemical processes. Like we already have a full explanation of all this. There's no anomalies there. And so because they don't fit, they kind of bounce off, right? But if they keep accumulating, you get to this moment of dissonance, right? Where, there's a recognition that there are true anomalies that the present conceptual paradigm can't explain. And ultimately, it's like science progresses through, like one funeral at a time, right? This is kind of the lesson. You had kind of the certain models of science like Thomas Kuhn or who had sort of coined the term paradigm shifts, but other, philosophers of science like Feyerabend and Popper kind of understood this general process is a somewhat nonlinear, and that maybe we're at a moment of kind of a nonlinear shift in both our scientific models of reality as well as maybe a more, like our taking metaphysics seriously, right? Like essentially what attracted me to physics and philosophy is like these core questions. There's really kind of two, which is what's the nature of reality from a description that we can write down in math, which is physics, and what's the nature of reality that we experience as a subjective conscious being. right? And those are basically like, what's physics and what's consciousness questions. And ultimately, like, I see this sort of, Skywatcher initiative essentially is taking at least a bite at a certain part of that apple, which is, okay, if there are anomalous objects out there, truly not anomalous, that are of non-human origin, well, that is a very suggestive and highly valuable hint at new physics. And if it turns out that there's a deep connection, at least phenomenologically, between human consciousness and those objects, well, that, also is highly suggestive direction to explore, to understand the nature of consciousness. So these are the two most fundamental questions about reality that humans have at the moment. I don't know. I want to try to get at least closer to the answer.
I do as well. I love this stuff. It's extremely hubristic and naive to think that we've figured it all out. I think history has shown that whenever society thinks they figured it all out, somebody like Newton comes along and is like, well, actually, the world may work this way. And when it comes to the neuro-meditative side, telepathy, remote viewing, manifestation, like there's definitely something there. We were actually talking about it yesterday. Matt was like, "Oh, stop talking about this, Matt Odell." But I truly believe, like, it's funny, like the amount of Bitcoin blocks that have been mined via Bitaxes in the last year is somewhat anomalous when you factor in the amount of hash rate they produce versus the amount of blocks that they produce. And somebody hopped in my mentions the other day. It was like, it may be like some form of quantum bending via manifestation. The fact that we can see the chips and we're thinking about, is this going to mine a block? Does that sort of bend reality and shift the probability in the favor of owners of Bitaxes just because they have this somewhat ability to manifest block production because they're looking at the chip producing the hashes. I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it's just interesting to explore those type of ideas. I don't know if I've ever talked about the experiment with you, but I definitely talked about it with Jesse Michaels, who you know well when he was on the podcast, but the experiment of the Lite in the box with the 4 quadrants of the plant in one quadrant and a probabilistic random generator where it should hit each quadrant equally over a certain period of time. But when the plant's in the box, it hits the quadrant with the plant in it at a higher rate than should happen. So there is this like sort of quantum bending of life towards of life being able to sort of bend reality in its favor. And it definitely gets into the quantum realm, which fascinates me. And I'm not going to pretend like I can fully understand it, but I think my caveman brain is attuned enough to be like, there's a there, I think.
Yeah, I mean, this is, again, it's funny because if you had talked to me, I'd say even 2-3 years ago about this stuff, I would have been kind of the look down my nose at you, kind of sneering, haughty. Oh, you're just mixing quantum gibberish, woo-woo nonsense with some half-baked studies that people want to be true, right? And I was a hard-nosed physics guy. Okay, give me the equation, give me the studies, give me the math, right? Don't give me this woo-woo quantum bullshit. And I still have this sort of, I'd say, a visceral reaction to kind of woo-woo quantum bullshit where you have a mystery that seems non-local and you just go, oh, quantum is this sort of non-local mystery. And so that explains this other non-local mystery. And so this kind of connection between quantum mechanics and consciousness is kind of at the surface level, the thing people kind of reach for when it's just, a bunch of weird sort of wooey, new agey things. It's quantum healing, et cetera. I have a sort of a visceral aversion to it. But on the other hand, I know there's something really weird going on in reality, right? That we don't have a coherent framework for. And there are, I think, deep structures to existence that are heavily related to what it means to be an observer. I won't go too far down that particular, category theoretic and hypergraph model rabbit hole. But I think ultimately this kind of new agey kind of surface level intuition isn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't end up being wrong. It's kind of the bell curve thing, right? Or like whatever the meme, right? Where it's like the left of the bell curve is just, like consciousness is non-local, quantum mechanics is non-local, like you can manifest reality. And the mid curve is like, no, physicalism is real. Consciousness is just an emergent phenomenon, right? Daniel Dennett, Churchland are right. Like none of this new agey bullshit is real. And then the right curve is like, basically some, extremely abstruse category theoretic, model of the computational branch pairs of existence and, Knuth-Bendix completion and foliation of the hypergraph, yada, 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 right? And it's like, ultimately, it just turns into, observers are essentially slicing reality in a certain preferred reference frame. Similar observers slice it in a similar way. So they observe a similar reality that exists, we exist essentially in a common, say, epistemic and ontological reference frame. But, so there's a deep kind of metaphysical and physical relationship between the nature of observers and how they kind of slice through what is a much more kind of, I think, highly variegated, complex, almost infinite dimensional object. And that ultimately just, you can just describe that as, essentially, something like manifestation could be considered true, although probably not in the way it's kind of typically packaged up in like The Secret, right? It just happens to turn out that human consciousness and consciousness in general is an irreducible and fundamental feature of reality. And so once you have to bite that bullet, you have to kind of, invert the way you normally think about the relationship between objective, independent observables, right? The things that we normally take to be sort of the concrete stuff of existence that we are observing or interacting with, the kind of the phenomenon that we measure as part of our experience. And there's a very kind of fraught, age-old question in philosophy of science and ontology, sort of the nature of the external world and, realism versus subjectivism. And I think like all these sorts of classic philosophical dichotomies, it's always kind of a mix of both is the answer, right? That they're kind of false dichotomies. But, you can go from ultimately, this is the way science sort of works is you need to kind of go out and do the frontier experiments to kind of try to collect anomalies. And then on the other end, you need to have like serious scientists, philosophers, essentially trying to come up with candidate explanations that are trying to reach to that data and try to like interplay and do a dance with those anomalies and to try to come up with a new conceptual framework. Right. I think ultimately we're going to have to come up with new frameworks, like new vocabularies, new models, new math, essentially. That's kind of been the history. I expect that to continue. And then, we're going to wake up in 20, 30 years and it's just going to be kind of accepted that the world is a different way than we thought, 20, 30 years before. But yeah, I mean, the neuro-meditative stuff is the one that was the toughest for me to kind of bite the bullet on, or at least thus far. I'm suspending disbelief, certainly. And I've also had very interesting interactions with people, very, very powerful individuals that like hold to some similar sorts of beliefs. And, it's, human beings are fallible at all scales, right? There's a fractal disposition to heterodox beliefs and, things that also tend to give you a sense of your own power, right? If you believe that you can, if your will, is essentially metaphysical in the world, it's a sense of, I can manifest existence. That's a difficult question for me because it's always it dances between the metaphor and the ontological implication, right? And but the story of the bit axis is like, okay, well, the good thing about Bitcoin is it's a probabilistic process, right? So you should be able to tell over time if that's a statistically relevant anomaly. I haven't done the math. I'd be interested to see like how many standard deviations is it from, just a pure whether it's a Poisson process or something like that. Is that block reward coming in? And there was a major lab set up at Princeton called the Princeton Parapsychology Lab, which was doing these experiments for many years. It was shut down maybe 10 years ago. But they took basically a serious effort. I think maybe Jesse Michaels has talked about some of those things, different studies that they had done to try to pin down like these like anomalous fringe psi related phenomenon. And some people are convinced that they're legit. There's some interesting things you can do now with like random number generators or quantum random number generators, which I mean, I've seen some results of. I haven't seen like the scientific papers, but interesting sort of initial data. Quantum random number generator is a pretty simple thing. It's like you have a photon source, a beam splitter, and then kind of two detectors A and B. And this is like a pretty standard setup in like any physical and sort of any optical physics lab, which I worked in at Hopkins, setting up these beam splitters. So they're really, really precise in the sense that you can pretty much get exactly 50% kind of split, right, between detector A, detector B. And they're used a lot in quantum computing, all sorts of stuff. And so but you can package it up in a pretty small device. And so it's a photon source, a beam splitter, 2 detectors. And you can just have a readout on the screen, which is like, this line of like, A and B, right? So like say there's 1 million photons a second and it's doing a measurement, say 10 times a second, you're basically getting a plot of at any given point in time, was it A or B? And it's like a smooth average, right? So you would expect, right, that line to just be 50%, right? Kind of tiny little fluctuations, right? Just sort of random noise above 50-50. But what if you put people around it that are engaging in these, apparent neuro-meditative practices? Do you see deflection characteristically from the 50%? Do you see that deflection above a certain statistical threshold, say 1 in 100 or 1 in 200? Does that deflection take on a characteristic curve? Is that characteristic curve a degree of deflection consistent over many repeated trials? If you did that experiment, I think that's like highly suggestive data. There's something anomalous happening. How and why or what remains to be explained. But I don't think you could just rule out that observation if you were able to demonstrate that there's a statistically significant anomaly there. That's a pretty simple experiment that can be done right now. I think that's kind of what you just need to do, right? So maybe we'll be doing that.
So you just have somebody engaging in neuro-meditative activity, basically standing there and being like, I'm rooting for A. Just like thinking A.
I mean, this is beyond my expertise, but I don't know if it's literally you root for A or you just engage in a certain, lots of people engage in these practices, right? They're not like super anomalous, right? Like transcendental meditation, holotropic breathing, do like hemisync binaural beats. Like it's not truly exotic, but, it just, shifts people into different states of consciousness. We're just, people that meditate kind of know that, right? Kind of qualitative. It's a different experience, right? And different traditions have different names for it, but it's very clear that there are different states of consciousness human beings can engage in. I mean, the most exogenous ones are induced by psychedelics, right? Where it's very clear that when you're on different psychedelics, the world you perceive is radically different. The degrees of freedom, the structures, the patterns, the phenomenological presentation of information is like radically different. Whether you ascribe ontological reality to that presentation is a whole separate, like loaded question. But it's very clear that like the normal waking sort of conscious mode where we're navigating reality or having conversations or assessing, the workday, the emails is like a certain narrow slice of the space of possible conscious states that humans can engage in. And then there's a question if there are certain sets of those states that have a non-local effect on random processes, for example. That's a scientifically formulatable and testable question.
Yeah.
And then the telepathy tapes is the same thing, which is like, same thing. I was very much intrigued, had my curiosity piqued, certainly by those episodes. And I think it's about time we have the science done, right? Let's have, again, it's a difficult, more fraught thing. You got to get IRB approval. You have to put, these are children, right? These are families that are claiming to have these abilities in these conditions. And so you have to kind of set up the right controlled experimental conditions to try to see, okay, can they actually read the minds of their parents from an isolated room, right? Can you show that knowledge that they have could not be gained in any other way than through some sort of non-local consciousness, right?
And it's typically with the mothers, right?
Again, when you say typically, it's like I have seen no data, so I've seen no t-tests of but people construct all sorts of plausible explanations. Pair bonding, evolutionary selection. Early infants can't communicate, so they have to bond with the mother. And if there's this natural ability that's in all sort of biological creatures above a certain level of evolution, the evolution would select for it at a certain phase of development, and that would maybe lead to a bias in terms of the gendered presentation of that effect.
Yeah. No, this is weird. It's going to sound weird. I've had an experience like this in my life where my brother and I were Irish twins. We're only 11 months apart. We shared a room for 18 years. and I'd like to think we have a deep connection. There was an instance, my sister-in-law, my brother-in-law, the night of their wedding, or the morning after the night of their wedding, I woke up and my cousin, my wife, my then girlfriend, and I slept in the same room. And my cousin had actually shared a room with my brother and I down the shore in summers over like a 10-year period. My cousin and I woke up, and the first thing we thought is like, there's something wrong with Connor. And lo and behold, like he was in the hospital, and there was just something, we both like woke up and just like had a weird feeling. We're like, there's something wrong with Connor specifically. Like we both singled in on my brother, and he was in the hospital. And that was like a weird, an example of something like this that I truly believe. This isn't the only example I've heard of, but like there is some sort of weird, you hear it with twins all the time. Like there is this sort of telepathic connection.
Yeah, no, I've heard similar stories, right? And this is why it's so elusive and it's hard to pin down, because often the stories, when you experience them, they're extremely compelling, and you kind of know that what happened, right? And it's, I think, a very similar epistemics to like the UFO phenomenon, right? Well, like people that observe these things, that have a first person encounter with these objects or with the beings, it's like they know this is real, right? But it's hard, but it's a personal story. It's like it creates this this kind of cleavage between their sense of the reality of what they experienced and then anyone who hasn't. And it's like how to communicate the veridicality of that experience to a third person that hasn't seen it. It's just kind of the secretion of people having these anomalous experiences building up over time. I think we've seen this kind of take place. And then also the social taboos against discussing it as a thing, right? There's always lots of preference falsification in society, certain sets of taboos where topics are considered off limits to discuss. And I think both of these taboos, and obviously Bitcoiners know how to observe when taboos are shifting, right, in society, where you're like, yeah, this is a thing that's an in-group kind of discussion topic, but I know the out-group sees it as fringe or taboo or not serious. Those are not objective facts. Those are just how human beings choose to relate to certain issues. And I think the UAP phenomenon and psi phenomenon are two very important subjects that are undergoing this socialization process. And we're in the middle of it right now. But that idea of synchronicity, that idea of non-local connection between human beings or even animals, is something I take very seriously, right? As like data, right? I have, lots of potential like physical and metaphysical explanations for it. But it's also something I think the government has paid close attention to for a long period of time, right? So just like it kind of served the government's interest to have kind of UAPs be a fringe taboo subject that was scorned by popular discussion as part of a psychological operation to dissuade serious attention on it. I think the same thing has been underway on the psi side, right? And I think for very similar reasons. And so the supposition then that I've drawn is, okay, I believe with a high likelihood that there are legacy programs, so to speak, that have been under high degrees of compartmentalization associated with UAP retrieval and reverse engineering of non-human objects, craft with highly anomalous material construction and performance characteristics. I think also the study of anomalous forms of human consciousness or capacities associated with human consciousness have also been the subjects of deep and very serious long-running study by U.S. government or related entities. And I think those two research activities were intimately related. And so, yeah, I think this is the rest of the world sort of slowly and very haltingly and uncomfortably kind of adjusting itself to certain facts and knowledge that certain elements of our society have known for some time. And this is the process of integrating that knowledge in a deliberative fashion across society. That's the process we're undergoing right now.
Yeah. You know me. They call me Marty Jones. I'm very much open to all these theories and all that. But I think the smoking gun for me, this was years ago, men who stare at goats. Like I truly believe that the government does try to normalize some ideas via Hollywood. And I think that movie specifically was like the government's working on remote viewing and telepathic sort of endeavors, and it's been laid bare in declassified documents that they have been testing this stuff.
Yeah. And it's not like a historical thing. Like, those are active programs. Pretty sure of that. I mean, you could just read Lou Elizondo's book. And going back to your point about, okay, there seems to be some biological connection here, some evolutionary selection pressure here. And it doesn't take a whole lot to kind of engineer a kind of plausible scientific explanation, which is if consciousness is fundamental, if there are degrees of freedom that are accessible to conscious beings, there's a root structure of reality that isn't just, essentially billiard balls, particle fields, et cetera. Then evolution would explore it, right? Like, it's a degree of freedom that evolution has a selection advantage to figure out how to use. And if there were ways of essentially getting small hints of danger, right, through exploiting that degree of freedom, well, that would be a selection advantage. And maybe in modern society, right, or in modern, ever since we became agrarian settled civilization, like that latent ability, which just became attenuated over time, sort of socialized out of us, especially as we grew. But in certain parts of the population, maybe through just genetic lottery, as well as professional self-selection, right, especially individuals, say, involved in special operations or high-risk intelligence activities, those abilities that were latent or genetically, gifted are extremely relevant. And if that were the case, you would expect the government to be very active in identifying such individuals and steering them into such programs, because they would have a selection advantage. They would be less likely to get killed in an ambush, right, when they're conducting a high-risk operation behind enemy lines. And maybe some of those individuals might even have an exceptionally strong ability to engage with these other types of these anomalous programs relating to UAPs. And you would want to put those individuals to work in those programs. So this is kind of a Bayesian branch sort of inference process, where if you present someone with a proposition at the further end of the branch, like the government has psychic spies that are summoning UAP objects, trying to even fly them with psychic human beings, it sounds kooky and crazy, right? But if you actually start from a more just one branch up, right, that's just a slight deviation from your current priors and worldviews, and you just add on these plausible assumptions and inferences from government and associated first-person experiences, you can kind of get yourself out to that part of the tree with only like a few hops. But most people don't do that. Most people just sort of look at the outer proposition, and it's so far from their current priors that it seems impossible. I think that's not likely to be true.
Yeah. And pulling this back into the context of what's going on geopolitically right now, the matter-of-fact statement earlier this week, because considering everything that's going on, within the administration, there does seem to be like a calm, cool, and collected sort of stature or sort of perspective that they're putting forward. It does, from my observation, it does feel like they think they have an ace up their sleeve, whether it's something economically. We were talking about it yesterday on the Bitcoin magazine or Bitcoin conference spaces, like this idea of pricing the gold up, repricing the gold to its current price and maybe dumping it, buying Bitcoin as a geopolitical move to do to China what happened when they went on a silver standard when the world was adopting a gold standard. You talk about the technology that we may have that we haven't disclosed yet, that is sort of a trump card. I don't know, just getting back to the metaphysical, the spidey sense that you were just describing, it like observing all this, it's just like what is being portrayed publicly in the mainstream media and even via some press conferences by administration officials. Like it just seems like that's all a facade, a sort of sideshow that's being presented to the world while things are happening behind the scenes.
Yeah, I think it's actually kind of a mix of both, to be honest. I think you have both a kind of O'Doyle rules mentality, right? Which is like, like just a bunch of like extremely self-confident blowhards just driving themselves off a cliff. And I won't name certain individuals in the administration who I think have that type, right? And then I think there are kind of like the master planners who think they have the ace up their sleeve, right? But like the Trump administration isn't this sort of entirely coherent, right? It's like a court with lots of different factions. Some I think that feel like they have more farsightedness, others that are, much more able to kind of win the president's ear for a particular purpose in a particular day. So I think it's both at once, right? I mean, I had almost the same sort of vibe, right, of what's really going on here. It's like there's a certain sense of confidence, right, that's undergirding this administration. It could be unfounded confidence, could be this sort of irrational O'Doyle rules blowhardness. But it also could be based off of what they believe is to be pretty solid advantages. And there are two categories of that type of advantage that they might be leaning on, right? One is like this very exotic type of thing, like the true, whatever breakthrough propulsion or energy that they've got, locked up for decades that now they've got their hands on as they've taken the reins of power and done some Doge purges and tried to like corner the legacy programs and do all the behind the scenes, yada, yada, yada. That's a scenario. But then there's just the more prosaic, quote unquote, in the public domain technology curves that they might just be looking at as giving them kind of a get out of jail free card in the next 2 to 3 years, potentially sooner, when it comes to AI and energy in particular, right? And so, I mean, it's no surprise that like folks are very much obsessed with these exponential curves on AI scaling, and they seem to be holding up. And it's becoming increasingly the opinion inside relevant tech circles and filtering into the political circles that we're not that far away from having like, essentially frontier models that are generated principally by other frontier models, to the point where humans are no longer the primary factors of production for new AI systems. And that is then leading people to speculate, if you hit to that point in the next, 16, 24, 36 months, do you get to a point of bootstrapping self-improvement? And that then kicks in, a new phase of the exponential curve. And that we could be hitting a few of these phase transitions where most AI research is accelerated dramatically and then becomes less and less relevant with humans in the loop, and then gets this sort of takeoff, whether it's a slow or a fast takeoff, but essentially where we become less relevant to its future improvement. There's that sort of trend lines, which folks are now, pulling forward to something like 2027, 2028, maybe 2029, which is in the political time horizon of DC now, right? That's like, when JD wants to run for president, right? And so that's one major, I think, exogenous variable that's coming in that's saying that's, could be Deus Ex Machina, right? For, okay, there's a bunch of tariff induced mess. There's supply chain snarls. There's maybe even a recession. But don't worry, like AGI is going to come to the rescue in 2026, 2027, and everyone will forget it because we've got this productivity miracle. That combined with, the certain strong hints, again, it's hard to tell how much of this is people talking their book, and it's always been around the corner, this idea of economically relevant fusion. So Helion is, Altman and Thiel-backed firm. They took SoftBank money. Their evaluation about $4.5 billion earlier this year. Whispers are that they're planning to sort of unveil their system, which is being built out in Washington next year. I think there's a lot being lined up for like America's birthday, to be honest. As like, okay, let's do this big, like massive flex basically on the world and on your domestic politics. Like, 2025 was messy, but we had to clean up the Biden regime's messes. We had to deal with all the China stuff. We had to basically we had to crack some skulls. It was messy. It was confusing. It was chaotic. Don't worry. That's all behind us now. And then they roll out, the stuff. They roll out, oh, look, AI's coming. It's going to be awesome. We've got fusion coming. It's going to be awesome. We made all these trade deals. We're making so much money. Like, we're probably going to do yield curve control on the back end, and we're going to be printing money to boost asset prices. We're going to lie about inflation. Don't worry. Right. So it's like, it's going to be a massive psyop trick. Right. But they need to have a few a few things that kind of goose the popular imagination. So that might be part of this overall sense of confidence. But I do think this idea of a techno-industrial revolution is top of mind for the sort of core policy engine inside the Trump administration. Like they're laser focused on AI, robotics, breakthrough energy, and space. And in principle, it has nothing to do with UAPs. I think in practice, I think it's you're sort of stepping stones in that direction. And I think it's no coincidence that China sort of subtly released a news report about their own fusion research reactor. They have a few different versions of it, but this one in particular happened to essentially be a clone of the particular technique that Helion uses. And so this is now like the high stakes technology competition for these breakthrough industries now. The DeepSeek stuff has been poured over by every think boy on Twitter, but it's a real sense of concern. I think ultimately we're going to head towards a recognition that no one can really win this race, to be honest. Because if we get too far ahead, I mean, the folks behind this kind of AI 2027 kind of new report, they're worried that if the U.S. actually gets this takeoff lead, that China will literally just invade Taiwan, or will just nuke the supply chains, or bomb our data centers, or do something which now seems fanciful. But in the sort of realist logic of if someone's about to have a runaway strategic overmatch, you just have to eliminate it and be willing to risk war in order to do that. And these are sorts of the propositions that sound like, okay, this was like a less wrong blog, but now I think they're going to be the subject of, high level discussions inside DC. So we're in this bizarre era of, I would say, accelerating disruptions, the kind of hockey sticks that are overlapping. And I see these three hockey sticks that I just happen to, be paying close attention to. Like there's the Bitcoin hockey stick. All your listeners are very focused on. A bunch of, autists saw that hockey stick coming a long time ago. And, when a bunch of autists see a certain hockey stick coming, I pay attention when they start shaking the sheet. There's a hockey stick coming, and this is gradually, and then there's going to be a suddenly here, and most of the world goes, oh, you're crazy. Like that's not going to happen. And, I don't know. Okay. I think certain subsets of this community are a little bit hyperbolic, but I think the general vibe is, yeah, they're seeing something coming. So there's that hockey stick. There's the AI hockey stick. And then there's the UAP hockey stick. Maybe less in terms of the actual phenomenon accelerating, but more like the preference cascade and the official stance towards the topic going through a kind of a hockey stick, which will have actual hockey stick effects on our society and economy. And I'm just looking at these three things, and I see each community kind of in their own autistic little bubble, right? It's like the Bitcoiners just obsessed about Bitcoin. That's the only thing. Hyper-Bitcoinization is this astrological event. It's coming, I will be redeemed for having been proven right. The naysayers, the no-coiners, they'll get their comeuppance. The great I told you so moment will be upon us, and there'll be a characteristic before and after, right? Where Bitcoin and Bitcoiners essentially get to run the show. In the AI community, it's the same idea. You had kind of fringe blogs obsessed with AGI, and now it's like, okay, it's now the thing inside DC, just like Bitcoin is. Like, it's the topic of national policy. It's no secret it's no surprise that David Sachs is the AI and crypto czar. These are two conjoined kind of accelerating digital disruptions. The UAP thing is a bit different, has different underlying processes, but it has its own sociological characteristics like Bitcoin, kind of in-group community, podcasters, influencers, factions, right? Canonical lore that you have to go down the rabbit hole to understand. And then there's a redemptive event that's just around the corner, right? Instead of hyper-Bitcoinization, it's disclosure, right? Or instead of the singularity or the AGI takeoff, it's this disclosure or consciousness awakening. And I'm just looking at these three different topics that are all objectively accelerating in various ways, depending on how you measure it. But I'm very close to all three of them, and I just discern this acceleration. And they have the same sort of sociological patterns, manifested in each. They're all happening at this roughly the same time, with like a speculative, convergence in terms of maybe a, like kink in the curve happening towards the end of this decade, which is not that far away. And that's just like an observation. I don't know if there's an underlying explanation. If it's just a coincidence, maybe it's evidence we're in a simulation. Maybe I'm living in a Truman Show, and it just happens to be these like niche interests are like now the things driving human civilization potentially. But I just have to like, I'm either completely schizophrenic in a Truman Show or it's actually happening. And I can't do much about being a schizophrenic or being in a Truman Show. So I have to operate on the assumption that it's actually happening. In which case, okay, there's a high amount of leverage in making the right decisions and trying to interpret events in the right way, quickly. So yeah, I could say I'm a little bit stressed out.
You don't look stressed. You're wearing a great Friday shirt.
I'm holding it together, man. I'm holding it together,
No, but I completely I still haven't figured out in my mind because I haven't gone down the rabbit hole enough how UAP sort of fits into this convergence. I can definitely see the convergence of AI and Bitcoin very clearly. Like if this AI does become autonomous to a degree and it gets to the point where it's competent at completing very complex multi-stage task and interacting with other models and other agents, like it's going to need money. And I think that money will be Bitcoin. And it was funny. I'm not sure if you saw it. I think it was old, but the clip resurfaced yesterday. The experiment that this company did with AI agents in Minecraft, and they independently sort of converged on the gems in Minecraft and as money, and essentially create like a sound money sound monetary system within their Minecraft server. Sort of naturally, the AI agents are like, oh no, this is the best money. So I think something similarly will play out there with the emergence of competent agents and autonomous agents and their recognition of Bitcoin as good money, and that'll lead to a weird form of Bitcoin adoption where these agents actually want it to complete tasks. I don't know how the UAP fits into that, but
I mean, I could explain.
Okay.
I think these things are going to converge. So, it requires certain more speculative assumptions, but, like the most direct one that I can imagine is kind of technology change, right? In particular, two types of technology that increases the efficiency of refining gold from the Earth's crust and or bringing asteroids into becoming economically viable sources of gold. If you change if you change like a one-time supply shock of gold and or you change the stock to flow ratio of gold no longer ceases to be viable as a monetary metal. And markets will discount that pretty quickly into the future. So right now, most people, I say baseline time frame for asteroid mining is 2040 on the earliest side. Probably if you just look at more likely scenarios, 2050 to 2060, which is beyond most of the duration of most bonds, most derivatives markets, most commodity futures markets. And so that's like a thing that's not priced in literally. There's no instrument really to trade that. But if you had technology start to diffuse in the next 5 to 10 years, that dramatically accelerated or expanded the capabilities for like high efficiency, laser based ore refining and or novel propulsion systems that made asteroid mining much more feasible on a shorter time horizon, right? That would then pull forward people's expectations from say 2050, 2060 to like 2030, 2040. And then that starts getting priced into derivatives markets and commodities futures pricing around gold. And that's like a one-time thing, right? Like that's human civilization was digging things out of the dirt for 5,000 years. And that became monetary metal for all of our civilization. And I think people just assume that like, the technological growth curve that's accelerating in all these other ways will not have any implication on the stock to flow ratio of gold, which seems like, I don't know, like people are making all sorts of assumptions around AGI changing synthetic biology and breakthroughs in fusion research and all these other crazy world civilizational shifts on our technological capacity, but no one assumes that like this one little number, right, from, that's core to the function of gold in the monetary system goes from say 2 to 3% a year to 5 or 10 or 15 to 20% a year, and gold then effectively becomes demonetized. It becomes more like a copper, right? That's like I don't have to put too many assumptions into about real like aliens and shit to make it seem that like actual gold will become demonetized in the next 10 to 20 years by pricing in these technological disruptions which could manifest in 20, 30 years. And then there's lots of other stuff, right, that could compound on top of that. And that's so in a world of like accelerating technology change and where the factors of production and automation and agentic artificial intelligence that start to produce new processes that are radically more efficient and more effective than current industrial processes, then I look around at anything that is currently scarce. Right, like one sort of banal way of summarizing is like, if the ASI doesn't kill us, or we don't use it to develop pathogens that wipe ourselves out, or cyber attacks that take down the global grid, if we actually get, say, a good, ASI transition path, we're going to be in a world of like decreasing scarcity for most industrial products, most goods that satisfy human needs. And we'll just be expanding factors of production at an extremely high rate. And so the world system will need something that is scarce, that is not going to be devalued by some technological breakthrough. Right? It's like the risk of the 20th century was governments will devalue your currency. Right? And the risk of the 21st century is that technology will devalue your scarce assets. Right. And so you're going to need digital scarcity that, has difficulty adjustment. So regardless of your factors of production breakthroughs, your Moore's law or your energy growth rate, Bitcoin will still keep producing to its supply schedule.
Yeah.
But I think that's just like too much schizo to pack into one
No, it's not.
scenario.
It's not.
I think it's likely to be true. The problem is I look around DC and I see the kind of typical think tanks doing the typical think tank thing. And everyone's like in a tizzy about tariffs and the geoeconomic US-China jibba jabba. And I'm like, okay, that's a 6-month issue. Like,
yeah,
what's a 6-year issue? A 6-year issue is this stuff. And 6 years is like, I've got young kids like, okay, I'm not trading the next 6 months. I want to trade in my life over the next 6 years to ensure that like I am prepared for these disruptions. And I would like the government to have a time horizon that matches mine. And I don't see that. I see everyone just obsessed with the noise of the day and having a hot take. And yeah.
Well, going back to this sort of confidence, I don't know if it's O'Doyle rules confidence or measured confidence due to information that the Trump administration has that has not been disclosed. But I think there were two things in recent weeks that really piqued my interest in the sense that like, oh, there's some recognition here. And it plays into the geopolitical sort of brush up we have with China right now, specifically is Oklo had the red tape ripped off. Like Oklo, you can go begin planting your SMRs down. I think they have an official contract with the government to do something on military bases, which is good to see. I've been following Oklo for years. They were very active within the Bitcoin mining community, like trying to just game plan with Bitcoin miners about how Bitcoin mining could help them sort of bootstrap their economic viability in the places they wanted to go. And so it's like cool to see the red tape there. And then the other thing, I mentioned it yesterday on the spaces that we were both on, the, again, matter of fact, disclosure that in, I believe, 2016 or 2017, we were made aware that there were transformers being imported from China that were being integrated into substations that had backdoors that would enable China to remote shut them down and disrupt our grid. So saying like planting this flag in the sand for anybody paying attention, like, no, we are going to do some reshoring or shifting of our manufacturing supply chains because there is this Achilles heel that could potentially exist within our grid system that in the form of this backdoor that China's integrated into some of these transformers. So those two things, it's like recognizing that's happening, and then at the same time letting the nuclear energy proliferation really begin to take off.
Yeah, well, it's kind of interesting. Our next door neighbors at BPI, the office downtown right now, which is in an industrious, is Aklo. They're like literally next to us, and then just down the hall, like one office over, is a quantum computing company. So it's like, okay, they're all right there, right? Throw them all together. But no, I think you're right, and I think my expectation, I think this administration is putting together they want to change the narrative ultimately, right? They kind of fucked up the last 2 weeks, and I think the wiser hands are now taking control of the wheel, and the O'Doyle rules chant is now saying like, shut up, guys, like let's get our shit together. And now they're trying to put together packages of big ideas. I think one of those could be a multi-trillion-dollar like techno-industrial investment project. A big bazooka essentially designed to hit all of these things, right? Domestic reshoring semiconductors, but also nuclear energy supply chain, as well as nuclear energy production, space technologies, automated manufacturing, the idea to kind of get robotics back. I mean, it's basically they're panicked that like China basically has the Silicon Valley ecosystem driving a flywheel, but for advanced manufacturing and robotics and drones and EVs. And they have a whole massive, gigaclusters of these sorts of integrated ecosystems that they've built up over 20, 30 years. And we're like, oh shit, we need to kind of like catch up to them on those industries and like look ourselves in the mirror and be like, okay, yeah, we've got all the software and the whiz bang gizmos, and but do we actually have the hard manufacturing capacity, the industrial ecosystems to match that? It's going to require trillions of dollars of crash investment, which, where's that money coming from, right? You're going to have to borrow, right? And so this idea of fiscal probity, fiscal, consolidation, I think is all just a big psyop. I think it's just basically to engineer, a certain agreement with the Republicans for the reconciliation process now, before they find other tools to basically goose fiscal spending, but done in essentially their version of industrial policy. And it's going to be quite controversial, I think, in some of the Republican coalition, because there's a lot of folks that are very much, against industrial policy. But I'd say like the ascendant wing, inside the U.S. is that this is a techno-industrial competition that is for all the marbles, basically. And it's going to be taking place in the next, between now and 2030, essentially. And so, Katie bar the door, screw the bond market. Like, I'm sorry, guys, we got to win, right? We've now declared a trade war, which is effectively now total economic war with China. Like, supply chains are effed right now. Like, there's like no freight coming in. We basically have we basically mutually embargoed each other. It's like people are going to the mattresses, right? And there's it's high stakes. And in that environment, people are like, oh, you're threatening the Fed independence. I'm like, bro, like of course they are, right? Like, what I was talking about this like 6 months ago. Like, of course they are. Now, of course, there's how they do it, right? Whether it's they literally fire him, or they just basically put him in a corner, or they put some sort of Doge minion by his computer that just types in instructions from Besant or something, right? It's like, no, sorry, like, yeah, you're not fired, but like, we've cut off all your access to your computer systems, and U.S. Marshals are now preventing you from speaking at the podium, right? It's like, I don't know, like there's lots of ways of enforcing fiscal dominance. Those are more hyperbolic, but I think that's just is going to happen, right? And then we're going to use all sorts of measures to do like backdoor QE. Like, that's just going to happen. We're going to use Japanese central bank to do swaps, century bonds, maybe even that could be funded with dollar swap lines as like what I call like geopolitical reach around QE. It's not the Fed explicitly buying up these bonds. It's just using providing dollar liquidity to other central banks to buy up our bonds. I think that's just what's going to happen. And they're going to, as a sign of like the Overton window shifting, I was listening to the Odd Lots podcast, and they just had a guy on there, a lawyer, who is, talking to them about, the kind of Mar-a-Lago core, this idea of could they just decide unilaterally to like extend the duration of existing treasury securities. And, Tracy and what's his name?
Joe
were like incredulous that the lawyer who's like teaches like his niche expertise is like sovereign bond market law. He's like, yeah, like the government could just decide to like extend the duration of their existing issuance. There's like no contractual, it wouldn't be considered a contractual default if they were just like, yeah, that 10-year bond, we're now going to pay it out over 30 years. And they're able
to amortize the payments they extend the amortization schedule so they don't have to roll over debt. Interesting.
Just unilaterally decide, like we're going to manage our duration, Now I think that would be like the extreme end of the policy option set, right? I think the more reasonable is basically trying to find these ways of monetizing assets to plus up the TGA that can be used to fund buybacks. An even more clever idea might be to use the sovereign wealth fund as an off-balance sheet entity that can essentially leverage up and buy debt, right? As like a sinking fund. I noticed that Scott Bessent took a picture with Seb Gorka in front of a portrait of Alexander Hamilton the other day. And these guys like signaling. They like doing these little hints. And Hamilton's like famous innovation in American financial history was this idea of a sinking fund. Essentially, how do you eventually create an off-balance sheet entity that kind of helps relieve the government of debt, right? And it came from Bank of England kind of related innovations in the 17th century. But it's like, okay, we got too much debt. We got essentially this, someone's got to eat these losses. How do we kind of cleverly structure, essentially deep, like printing money, but using a series of financial engineering tricks where it's not obvious how the money is printed, right, and where the effects are on the government's balance sheet. And a sovereign wealth fund is a very useful vehicle for that, right? That you could use. So I just think people underestimate when push comes to shove, when the government's when a powerful government is backed into a corner, like they'll come up with shit, man. Like everyone's like, oh no. I think during the 2008 financial crisis, it was like, this is the moment the system's going to collapse, right? Like the dollar's dead because no one thought the Fed could just expand its balance sheet to like $9 trillion or whatever. And you go, oh well. I didn't think that they could expand the balance sheet to $9 trillion. Well, they did. It's like, when we think the Fed's collective balance sheet or sovereign wealth funds couldn't expand the balance sheet to $30 trillion. You go, oh no, they can't do that. I don't know. They can. Or like in the 30s where we basically defaulted on the debt and everyone thought, oh, this is going to be like a run on the US dollar. Yada. It's like stock market didn't collapse. Like, it was just, there you go. We're just flipping the script. Or 1971, like went off the gold standard. Yeah, there was stagflation. Like I think people underestimate the like sheer inertia of power in the global system, and that there are lots of tricks up the government sleeve. Do all sorts of accounting, maneuvers. There's like armies of lawyers inside the Fed and the Treasury whose like sole job is to like come up with this like obscure shit, and then in a crisis, it's like, boom, there you go. And you're like, oh, that's not allowed. Like, there are rules. It's like, there's no rules, bro. It's like, there's no rules. They do what the hell they want. And yeah, so I just think, when push comes to shove, and Trump is, of course, this, now is commander in chief that's willing to wield executive authority, in a self-confident way without, self-constraint. Right. And there's an irony here. I'm in a hot take ramble, but there's an irony also. Like, I have mixed opinions of the policy approach and the implementation here. And one of the the negative opinions is it's essentially central planning. It's effectively Trump just deciding, okay, here's what the tariffs should be. Here's how I'm going to rewire the global trade system. And I think there's doing it out of a strategic ambition and a way to challenge Chinese mercantilism and rewrite the global balance of competitive advantage. And so you kind of have to have executives do national policy in the national interest. But I think that quickly goes into this domain where a few smart people at the top can decide where credit should be allocated, right? Like, we need more robot factories. So here's $10 billion to build some robot factories. And in the end, right, those just become grift machines where people close to the circles of power get preferred access to the money printer, right? This is the classic Bitcoin argument about QE and all the other sort of distortions of the financial system is there's an inherent pathology that generates. And just because it's your guys doing it doesn't mean it's like good, right? And so I think just this is the great tension, I think, between national security, strategic competition. This tendency that to beat China, we have to kind of emulate China is very dangerous, because like we don't want to just emulate China. Like it's like we don't want to just become the America version of China Lite, right? With central planning, credit, capital controls, financial repression, preferred allocation of credit to like strategic industrial sectors, effectively state-owned enterprises that are arm's length from the elite factions that run the country. That seems like not a recipe for free markets, innovation, competition. The thing that actually America, at least rhetorically, has positioned itself as the leader of. So there's a danger here that like we just sort of go full China, but in like our own way. I hope we don't do that. And I think Bitcoin is a natural counterbalance to that, right? Ultimately, right?
Yeah. No. I'm pulling up the tweet because there's something that's confirming this thesis already. A headline yesterday: breaking. SpaceX, Anduril, and Palantir teaming up to lead bid to build Trump's Golden Dome U.S. missile defense system. It's like those three companies are very tightly aligned with the administration.
And that also is like, okay, if I have my if I put on a certain lens here of UAP informed speculation, it's my strong belief that the Star Wars program in the 80s was effectively a cover for ramping up these UAP programs, which were kind of in stasis in the 70s a bit after Carter came in and kind of purged the CIA, and there was the stagflation shit, a lot of financial insecurity. And so I think whatever research programs were kind of, put on some bit of stasis a bit. And I think Reagan came in, he's like, all right, we're gonna ante up on this stuff. And it by that point they had been sort of semi-privatized. So there was a lot of incentive to kind of turn the machine back on. I think the Star Wars initiative, SDI, was basically just a massive front to like ramp up these secret R&D programs. And of course, that was to the great benefit of the dominant sort of techno-industrial defense system at the time, which was dominated by, Lockheed, all these defense primes, right? Northrop Grumman, et cetera, which have now kind of been on the wane as these ascendant defense primes, AI infused, sort of Silicon Valley originated Palantir, Anduril, SpaceX, kind of Elon, Teal orbit companies are now in the driver's seat in the kind of the political economy of the defense, intelligence, and industrial system. And so the Golden Dome is kind of like, to me, essentially Star Wars 2.0, right?
It's a big front.
But so if my assumption was that Star Wars 1.0 was essentially a front for, rejiggering and catalyzing acceleration of these more exotic programs, I think Golden Dome stuff would be the natural similar modern counterpart. And of course, it's all framed as this U.S.-China competition. But yeah, I mean, but then you get to these, you want to go real rabbit hole here is like, okay, the thing that about the NHI conversation that people don't want to take seriously is like the implications of it being true, right? Everyone just wants to like just take that one little dip in the water and go, okay, yeah, this universe is a big place. There's probably other intelligent civilizations around. Hey, maybe even that planet we just made observations of actually has life, and maybe that means life is pretty common throughout the universe. You accept that, and maybe they're sending probes around to buzz, hither and yon. But if you have to like take very seriously your view of geopolitics in light of what you might call exopolitics, right? If geopolitics is the relations between human states, human institutions on terra firma, then exopolitics is the relation between human civilization and non-human civilizations. Which, again, following that basic logic of you're on a Bayesian tree and you just carry forward the inference from limb to limb, from branch to branch, then if you're at a point of the branch where you take on at least as plausible that there are non-human intelligences associated with some higher order, some higher exopolitical, local to our galactic neighborhood system of intelligences, or some regulative principle that governs the relationships between those entities and their technology and their, activities, something you might call a civilization. and we're embedded in it, and we are just, waking up to that fact, right? To my mind, there's like an inverse of the AI alignment problem now, right? So everyone in AI circles is obsessed with this idea that we need to align these AI systems, which could be constructing their own independent civilization, alien to us. We need to ensure that their civilization, their activities, essentially their goals and norms, are aligned with ours in some way, right? To ensure that our interests aren't, supervened or abrogated, and there's failure modes of extinction risk if that alignment doesn't occur successfully. So that's obviously the obsession of all the sort of AGI, ASI pilled autists in San Francisco. But I think there's a more important alignment question, which is alignment of human civilization in the light of the potential reality of a higher order civilization or a higher order structure of norms that we're dimly aware of, and that become more relevant when you reach certain levels of technological capacity, right? Where you're now essentially coming out of your little walled garden here, and you're now going to be entering the cosmic club. Well, there's certain rules of behavior you have to abide by. If you don't abide by those, I don't know what the constraint or sanction is. So to my mind, it's quite important that we understand what those norms are, what those rules are, what those constraints are. And we sort of align ourselves and our AIs in such a way that we sort of integrate as a cooperative member of that larger community, so to speak, right? That's essentially we're auditioning, whether we like it or not, for membership in a cosmic club, right? And that cosmic club has certain norms, right? You have certain rules of decorum, you could say, and maybe human beings are not exactly the most decorous species.
Are we uncouth?
We're a little uncouth. We're like, there's maybe Bitcoiners, right, are a bit uncouth, but when we come to DC, we come to a Bitcoin policy event, right? Even Jack Mullers puts on a suit, right? So it's like, hey, it's a little bit uncomfortable for humans to kind of put on this suit, right, of behavior, but we're gonna have to, I think. And this is, I think, where the consciousness thing comes into play, because I think it's not just a technological component to that maturity. It's a consciousness element of maturity as well.
Yeah. No, again, going back to the convergence of these three things, it almost feels like we're playing through Fermi's paradox and getting to the great filter, and is our ability. Like and this is a theory we've talked about on this show as it pertains to Bitcoin since the beginning, which is this idea that to enter this cosmic society, as you described it, like maybe one of the preconditions is that you have to prove that you can invent a money that operates in the way that Bitcoin does, that is open, fair, verifiable, transparent, if you will. And then like you combine that with like AI, and like to your point, like I like to take the optimistic point of view, which is like where this convergence is happening, it's very obvious, and we're pushing it forward. And when it does ultimately converge at some point, probably in the near future, within the decade, have we sort of threaded the needle of proving we can invent a money like this, we can create artificial intelligence like this, combine them, and we are advanced enough to enter the cosmic community, if you will, and get through the great filter before we kill ourselves.
Yes, and of course, there's a lot of stakes in how you reason through that type of question. But there are these odd, I'm not one of these folks who just sees destiny or providence, right? But I notice anomalies, right? And it's just, there's sort of an anomaly associated with the convergence of all these different patterns and trends, and just like historical contingencies, like Trump just surviving, by a hair. Right. Literally. And if I really want to stitch together kind of a bit of a sci-fi plot that I find, that I chuckle over is, okay, assume we're on the timeline here where Bitcoin becomes global money, right? In 2040, 2050, what elements of human society are going to essentially have the most capital? It's going to be Bitcoiners, right? And what is the characteristic sort of cognitive phenotype of a Bitcoiner? They're pretty much autistic. They're obsessed with technology. They probably read a lot of sci-fi. And their mission in life was for Bitcoin to become global money. So once they succeed at that, and they're trillionaires, and they're still very autistic and obsessed with technology, what are they going to do? They're likely going to, use that money, and they're sort of not necessarily loyal to and haven't been enculturated into the same systems of institutions that, most rich people have been. So they might create new institutions, right? New think tanks, new research and development consortia, new media, new sort of breakthrough technology, new media, right? New sort of civilizational primitives, you could say, or structures, orthogonal, maybe interrelated with existing institutions. So what cohort of the near future, present path of humanity, if we survive, is likely going to create super breakthrough technologies? Likely going to be a bunch of, extremely autistic, extremely wealthy Bitcoiners. And what if in the space of possible technologies, something like, time travel or, time, exploration is possible? Now, we don't understand the nature of space-time. We think it's a higher level emergent, phenomenon, as well as some other deeper, more complicated structure. But if there's something like, that in the degrees of possibility for technology, obviously there's the famous grandfather paradox, but there's ways around that depending on how you model the metaphysics and physics of time. And so just assume that it's possible, right? So then what element of human civilization would likely first create such technology would likely be weaponized autistic Bitcoiners who would then have an interest in ensuring that Bitcoin gets created, right? And so if you would, maybe you can't send back beings, but maybe you can send back kind of information to kind of self-replicate these sort of AI time probes that then want to, collect information from history, right, to train future AI models, right, where maybe they're really saturated with capturing data, so you need to go back in time to get more data. And then also, maybe engage with their conscious AI time probes human beings to shepherd events in the path that they see as, their desirable outcome. And so they want to make sure Bitcoin exists. They want to make sure Satoshi gets the right, inspiration at the right time. And so then it would also explain why you need to have these three things converge. You need to have kind of the Bitcoin thing happen. You need to have it happen around the same time that the AGI thing happens. And it kind of also needs to happen around the recognition that these time probes are real. Right. So this would be like my sci-fi sort of schizo integration of these three. Now, I think there's other things that story doesn't explain. There's lots of other weird stuff associated with UAPs and human consciousness. But I just find it's a funny story that as I tell it, it starts to become superficially plausible.
It's very compelling. You're right side, I'm left side. The left side of me has always been there's
basically, the answer is these are all like David Bailey's, time probes and robot synthetic biology, artifacts that he's sending back in time just for the lulz.
Yeah, it is a fun timeline. Are you having fun?
I'm having an amazing amount of fun, man. I'll tell you, my life is just bizarre, and so I have to kind of lean into the absurdity of it. Because not too long ago I was doing the normal cyber China consulting bit and just sort of leaning in on the side into Bitcoin and then increasingly also into UAPs. And then when I decided to basically do the professional, jump in 100% into Bitcoin to help lead BPI as it kind of takes on this critical and sort of, very, very time sensitive mission, right, to effectively try to lock in, strategic shifts in U.S. Bitcoin policy. So as basically at the exact same moment I went in all on this, the UAP stuff started crashing into me, right? I don't seek it out really. It's I'll say yes to any meeting. I'll talk to anybody. But I don't have an agenda. I was I'm just curious. I want to understand what's going on. I'm not selling a newsletter. I don't have a podcast about it. I'm just okay, I'll meet with people and, they tell me some stuff. I'm okay, that's interesting. Is there anyone else I should talk to? Oh, okay. Yeah. I'll just keep doing that over and over until you talk to pretty much almost everyone you should. And now basically these things are all interleaving. I can't name names, but I can't tell you the number of people, very wealthy, important people in various different fields that I either have the first conversation is a Bitcoin conversation and then it bounces back to UAPs or consciousness, or people that I encounter on the UAP consciousness side who either have a background in Bitcoin or crypto, they made a lot of money in it, and now this is their thing. And there's just this, bizarre kind of interweaving of these two very, prima facie distant issues and social graphs that are very much connected in some weird way. And somehow I find myself sort of stumbling into the center of both of those, social graphs and policy issues. And there's people in Congress that I have conversations with literally about Bitcoin and about UAPs, like members of Congress that are very interested in both things and like in positions. I'm like, what? This is like it's just an absurd state of affairs, right? To like, I say that and it sounds, like nonsense, but it's
almost like you manifested your own reality.
That's what I'm saying. It's like a Truman Show, except like, it's the universe is projecting like the thoughts of like the bizarre, timeline into the path in front of me. And it's like, what's the maximally interesting thing for Matt Pines, right, to have happen? It's a massively narcissistic way to view reality, though, right? It's like, oh no, the universe is designing itself to like provide me the most exact balance of like extreme stress, cognitive,
stimulation,
stimulation, and like potential personal fulfillment, but like just kind of the carrot is just in front of you, right? You never quite get your hands on it. It's wild, man. So I basically like I'm just like decided, okay, I'm just going to lean into it all, right? And just be like, yep, if this is the timeline we're in, then going back to my earlier kind of, I could say, highly speculative thesis is that these are the three hockey sticks. They're all going to happen at the same time. DC and most of the world has no idea, it doesn't take either of those three seriously. If they do, they maybe take one of those three seriously, let alone all three. And I take all three very seriously. And it's like, okay, act as if those three things are happening, and then try to reason about how they're going to, intersect with each other. Right. And then try to play that out in our present geopolitical and geoeconomic context. I mean, I'm like, okay, that's like, I stop there. But I think we need new institutions. We kind of need to break legacy modes of thinking. Like I talked to folks at these institutions, Atlantic Council, RAND, et cetera. And I had these conversations with folks there, and they all secretly like are very curious about these things. Right. I think Bitcoin is becoming more normalized. Right. They're kind of dipping toes in the water there. The UAP stuff, for example, RAND has like a secret mailing list where people send UAP related articles to each other. But they don't talk about it. And there's no commentary. It's just like a secret little like distribution, which is like, for me, fundamentally like a huge problem. Because here's RAND, like their whole mission is like strategic foresight and analysis for the government. And you have, a bunch of PhDs in there who's like their whole job is to like look around corners. And yet they have this taboo, this preference falsification is so strong that like institutionally it's incapable of taking this question seriously. And so then I was like, oh shit. It's like, Bitcoiners have this realization like, the people in charge really don't know what they're doing. Right? Like there's no secret man behind the curtain with the master plan who's like looking out, 4 or 5 steps ahead. Right. There's like literally it's all just humans, doing normal human dumb shit and responding to their own narrow institutional incentives. So I think we just need to like, okay, there's like a blank space there. Like we sort of saw that with BPI is like nobody's actually just doing, serious Bitcoin policy in DC. Bitcoin's a serious thing. It's going to have implications for government policy at all these different levels. Just do a think tank bit, write some white papers, host some events, and then boom, like David Zell and Grant McCarty just like did the thing. And now it's a real serious thing. And because there was just, reality is malleable, right? In that way. And I think we don't like reason out of domain, right? We don't like take that and just sort of apply it in these other areas. But I think it's true. It's true across the board.
I do too. I think people can manifest. I think individuals like yourself, David, Grant, exist to bring this change about. They realize you can just do things. You go do the things and things happen. But the one thing I want to wrap up on is like talking about this convergence, and particularly now UAP, Bitcoin, if we're running under the assumption that there is some sort of physics breakthrough that exists, particularly in the realm of quantum mechanics. It's been a big topic more recently in Bitcoin, this idea of SHA-256 not being quantum resistant. Like, especially if there is some faction of the administration that recognizes that Bitcoin is going to be integral to the future of economic dominance in the world, and they may have a trump card in the sense that they have access to information about physics and advances in that field that probably revolve around quantum mechanics. Like, with that information, like, why would you be so aggressive with Bitcoin adoption, knowing that it does potentially have this quantum sort of Achilles heel if something isn't added to the protocol in terms of quantum resistant address structures? So is there anything at the intersection there that you've been thinking about?
Yeah. So I wrote a whole novel about quantum computing and AI. I started writing it like 9 or 10 years ago, and it's all about basically a quantum computer that, gets hooked up to the NSA's databases and does recursive self-improvement. So I was like, autistically obsessed with this for a while, even before I kind of started talking about Bitcoin. And then on the cyber side, I did a lot related to, cyber threats and U.S.-China technology competition. And I gained some information from very highly placed individuals that, they indicated to me, at least at the time, this was within the last 2 years, that cryptographically relevant quantum computing was at least 20 years away, maybe 10 at the outset. But really, essentially, it's still a basic science project. And this is the view from folks inside very well-placed positions in the U.S. government. Again, such assessments would be classified. And so I don't know if they gave me classified information or if they're just feeding me bullshit. But the thing about cryptography that's you have to always think about it adversarially, right? And think about the structures of incentives for cryptographic changes at scale in society, not just across Bitcoin, right? And we have evidence, right, from the Stone links that certain encryption schemes were intentionally weakened in very non-obvious ways. The NSA has armies of mathematicians whose sole job is to come up with extremely hard to detect weaknesses in encryption protocols, as well as engineer such weaknesses in such protocols. And so then you have to kind of think about this adversarially, right? In the sense of, and the government is not like a universal thing, right? Like, you can imagine certain folks at the White House level want to do Bitcoin, and there's certain folks who don't like Bitcoin, right? So from the perspective of people that don't like Bitcoin, so you like put like a simple matrix is like quantum computing is a threat in the near term or is not a threat in the near term. And then the government likes Bitcoin or doesn't like Bitcoin, right? And you kind of have to reason each of those different quadrants. And I can imagine scenarios where the government doesn't like Bitcoin and quantum computing is actually not a threat, but where they have an incentive to make it seem like it's a threat to try to force the Bitcoin community and as well as lots of other people to basically change their encryption schema to say one of these lattice-based methods, which is relatively new, has been tested, released by NIST, and people have poured over it. But the lesson of cryptography is sometimes these sorts of weaknesses can be very, very hard to know unless you're if you have 500 mathematicians working full time, like the NSA does. And so you have to have that inherent thing in the back of your mind that changing something, especially as because of some novel threat that's sort of urgent, right? That's can be done to sort of stimulate action that maybe wouldn't otherwise happen. So that's a threat model, right? There's people. I think you have to reason in different types of threat models. There's the actual threat from quantum computing that could break at least SHA-256, and then there's maybe a further breakthrough that would threaten Grover for mining. That's much. I think that requires a much higher threshold in terms of functional logical qubits. I think it's a serious question. It needs to be seriously explored. But I think you need to, if you're evaluating this rationally as a Bitcoiner, you need to lay out the matrix of scenarios here. And a key scenario is a intentional amplification of the threat of quantum computing in order to accelerate the adoption of weak cryptography to undermine Bitcoin. and that has historical evidence for it. And in terms of latent government, certain government agencies have the intention and the plausible capability to do it, right? So that's a scenario that has reasonable historical fact pattern. Agencies that are pushing such cryptographic schemes and have the capabilities, in theory, to insert undetectable weaknesses into such schemes, or to design such schemes in such a way that they're breakable only by them, right, with their own special techniques and computing power. So that's a, prima facie, a pretty substantial scenario to put on the board. You weigh that against the scenario of a continued progress in cryptographically relevant quantum computing that reaches a threshold where it can present a threat to public-private, key pairs that are vulnerable, which is especially like the early coins in particular. So I think we need to reason through it systematically as a community. I think we need to do hard analysis. I don't think it's something that you could just wave away either way. And I think you need to, be rational about assessing evidence for each of those different possibilities. And also think about the game theoretic dynamics associated with like different crises, right? Because systems of rough consensus are very, very stable, right? Unless there's some massive crisis, or at least perception of a massive crisis that activates all the human participants in the network in a similar way, right? And then kind of you can get failure modes where like, okay, everyone has to have this decision, and this is like maybe a separate podcast. Like you need to get Jameson Lopp on, you get all these guys that have their ideas about how this would play out, right? In sequence of, okay, where along this scenario in terms of continued, say, overt progress by the known labs, Microsoft, IBM, Google, et cetera, and continued demonstration of increasing size of functional logical qubits. They keep publishing papers that show they're getting to a threshold where maybe they could be within striking distance of SHA, et cetera. What do we think we're going to be doing, the collective royal we, as a development community, as industry, as miners, et cetera? How do we respond to that, right? There's different BIPs that have been proposed. They have, I think, different trade-offs in terms of, lots of technical details. And then other unknown, incentive dynamics associated with how such a BIP would be introduced. What you do with the vulnerable coins, right? Some proposals essentially you need to burn them, right? It's effectively a hard fork, right? Or do you put them into some sort of massive multi-sig, right? It's kind of this, or just leave them vulnerable. I think it's a fascinating question to take seriously, if only because I think it acts as a prism to view some of the core policy and game theoretic questions around Bitcoin in light of Bitcoin's new seriousness and new level that it's operating at. Right, it's operating at the level where you can imagine like a new version of like the New York meeting taking place, except it's at the National Security Council, right? And who's invited to that meeting, right? And what decisions are getting made, and how effective would those decisions be, in the minds of the participants and their ability to implement those decisions. Right, like different exchange operators. Okay, that's U.S. based, but what does that mean for Dubai? What does it mean for Singapore? Right, so it's a fascinating question, right? I think BPI may even design some tails up exercises to sort of play this out, because I think even if you don't have a strong opinion on the quantum computing threat itself, I think taking it seriously as a threat scenario is very useful to sort of start to tease out some of these new game theoretic and kind of policy incentive questions around Bitcoin and the rough consensus development model. And I think then, they also inform the larger technical debate about ossification, right? It's beyond my technical competence to adjudicate, but I think we are in this moment of sense that Bitcoin is, I think some developers feel like if there's no changes that happen now-ish, no changes will happen unless there's this crisis moment. But then you can imagine scenarios like, oh, if we're rolling out BIP, I think was it BIP 39? I forget the one that's the quantum resistant one.
It's 385.
385. Then what we should do OPCTV or something, right? Things like that. It's better to just discuss them out in the open now as a broader community and understand where the corner cases are. And what people's maybe latent attitudes are, because sometimes people will think something, but they don't want to say it. for whatever reason, because there's an internal social culture in different communities, such sort of sub communities inside Bitcoin, where it's like if you say anything, you're sort of speaking it into existence. So don't say the thing. You're manifesting the wrong thing. I don't know, man. It's a fascinating. I think quantum. And the other thing I'll say about quantum is that it is also on the top of mind of policymakers inside DC. It's one of the top questions that gets asked actually about like stablecoins and Bitcoin in general is like, what's your plan for quantum, right? Like Howard Lutnick is going around. That's all he's talking about, among other things. And now I suspect it's basically because he took the job at Commerce and the first thing they gave him was a briefing by NIST on the quantum stuff. Because it's like their whole thing. And they're really trying to get, the leadership to basically amplify it and kind of scare corporate America into adopting post-quantum cryptographic schemes, which is they know is going to be a multi-year process. Update firmware, embed it in all these different corporate systems. It's very, very complicated, very expensive to swap out encryption that's built into a lot of complicated software stacks. So as a bureaucratic matter, they wanted to elevate it to the principal and get him scared, right? Be like, China's almost there, sir. Like, if we don't get it, like they're going to get it, and then we have to ensure that our system isn't bricked by China, which could be a real threat. But it's also a very it's exactly the same thing you would do if you're like, we would like to have different encryption out there. So, yeah, I think I don't know if it's going to be a spillover though from the UAP stuff, to be honest, because I think the physics there is more disruptive in other ways. I think the physics there is, I go back to the earlier comment I had about how we figured out the physics of the atom and we created nuclear weapons. So whatever the next thing that we figure out about the physics of, say, space-time or the, additional field content associated with maybe a higher order symmetry group that is more fundamental than the symmetries associated with the standard model. Maybe there's some structure that unifies these different scales of nature. And then once we understand that structure, we understand maybe there are additional fields, additional forces, additional degrees of freedom that you can exploit. They maybe have different energy scales associated with them and might unlock huge amounts of energy. And once you do that, the lesson was going from chemical propulsion or chemical energy sources to atomic energy sources was orders of magnitude increase. So I don't know, my expectation would be the next thing would be orders of magnitude increase further. And it's not clear to me what, the proliferation constraint on that would be. Like there's a proliferation constraint around nuclear weapons. You have to have centrifuges. You got to have, uranium ore. You got to have lots of physicists and scientists, plutonium pits and triggers and all sorts of stuff. If it turns out that maybe you just need some other maybe highly, maybe just very strong magnetic field that's being amplified at a very high frequency in a certain metamaterial, in a certain pattern, you get an anomalous effect. Maybe there's other things to do with, neutrinos or things in the standard model that all of a sudden you can now use as a source of technology, communication, or weapon. I don't know. I'm more worried about pulling the black ball out of that jar, and then it would also kind of explain the secrecy. To be honest, it's like, hey, like there's something here that if it really gets out, anyone with a certain degree of competence could just, wipe us all out. Would not be good. Would not want that to get proliferated until we become a bit more mature as a species. This kind of goes to Peter Thiel's whole bit, which is we're either, if you survive, this technological kind of acceleration or exponential, quote, post-singularity moment, you either become like an angel, like an angelic species that's sort of fully altruistic, where no member of that society even has is it even able to form like the intention to destroy, right, other elements of society, the universe. They become perfectly altruistic, perfectly beneficent, other-minded, cooperative, right? Kind of, the higher, the all the harmonic angels are singing in the perfect choir, right, in the cosmic order, and there would just be no way to try to weaponize their technology. So either become that, like you become angels, or you become demons. You become a totalitarian lockdown sort of Borg society that's so controlled that a single point of control can unilaterally enforce counterproliferation of such destructive technologies, and that might be like failure modes. Is like you either elevate your consciousness where you just kind of you just don't be dicks anymore, and like the risk of using this technology poorly just kind of goes away because you realize it's just not cool to do, and that's going to it becomes inbuilt to your nature as a being, or you become subservient to some AI totalitarian Borg, and it's bad.
That was the crux of his lecture series, is Antichrist versus Armageddon,
but actually, I actually don't agree with it necessarily, because I actually think both are different versions of the same thing, right? Like they're just different ways of essentially describing what amounts to subsumption of the individual to some aggregate collective, where like just depends on where the force of constraint is being applied, right? It's essentially if you had the force of constraint built into your personality, like a Neuralink chip that made everyone in society perfectly cooperative and benevolent, and there was no urge for rage or having wrong think, right? You pressing the bad button that kills everybody. That just is there's a little chip in your brain that stops you from pressing the bad button. How is that different than just like being subsumed to some AI Borg? Because as soon as you have that chip in your head that can like selectively, constrain, universally and with perfect, fidelity, beliefs and decisions by any member of society, it's kind of the same thing as being an AI totalitarian Borg or this angelic harmonic structure. So I think that can't be the way this works. I think like the bit is consciousness. This is why like the relief valve is recognizing that there is a certain hard reality to individual consciousness, but it's not like a monad, right? You aren't just in individual consciousness, right? You also are in a degree of structural relations and interdependence with other individual nexuses of consciousness. So there's a mutual dependence, but you're an aggregate. You're not a unity. And I think being able to have a stable aggregate that doesn't collapse into like a totalitarian unity is kind of the whole bit, which is kind of the whole, I don't know, like metaphorical point of Bitcoin is like, how do you have consensus that isn't a unity, right? How do you have, essentially individuals making individual decisions that are in the rational self-interest that are able to secure their individual, property rights, essentially, in a sphere of freedom, but participate in essentially a collective project that has a higher order, that has a structure that's enduring and stable. But like, okay, that's like the metaphor that I think we want to try to apply at all scales. It's like, say with AI, right? Do you want to have it all collapse into like the God AI, where everyone basically just has to pay tithe to Elon or Sam, and he just controls society? Or do we have decentralized AI, right? Do we have intelligence in our pockets that's tuned to us, protected by us, that we control our data, that we can build and participate in the economy with? And maybe it's maybe if I really apply that to UAPs, right? Is like, some folks see UAPs as these angelic creatures, some see them as demonic. These are like our religious labels. But there's clearly like a certain variation in the phenomenology associated with these patterns of interaction or engagement that we interpret as benign or hostile or beneficial. And maybe there is like a difference at that scale in terms of, there's a mode of engagement and interaction that's kind of this right balance between individuation and like collective higher order, right? And there's never like, the whole point is to find that balance so that you don't collapse, society or become, subject to some hegemonic hive mind Borg. And that seems like the project, right? It's like, okay, that's the path that's the thread we have to put through the needle here.
It's like,
so anyways, that's my schizo wrap up.
Well, do we even have to thread that needle, or do we just, there's yin and yang, and there's always going to be these benign, neutral, positive and negative forces that are just interplaying and weaving in and out of each other.
Yeah, or an asteroid just comes out of, our blind spot and wipes us out, and there you go.
Maybe that would.
The universe doesn't owe you anything, bro.
The great meteor death, please come. Put us out of our misery of thinking of all these complex problems. They're fun, though. It's always fun chatting about them with you. Quick correction. It's bit 360, not bit 385 for the quantum resistant hash. This is always fun. I'm looking forward to BPI's event in June.
Yes, exactly. Yep. So phase 1 in the bit is to lock in pro-Bitcoin policy in the U.S. And so we're going heavy in the paint on that. And so we're putting on our annual flagship event in Washington, D.C., June 25th, Bitcoin Policy Summit. Sign up, request a ticket. It will be, not going to be bragging, but I think it's going to be a legit thing. I think people are going to be excited about it. So yeah, be on the lookout for more stuff coming out of BPI on that front. Really want to drive the agenda inside DC on Bitcoin and carry the momentum on these things. The Street Bitcoin Reserve, obviously the ideas around Bitbonds, but a whole swath of issues relating to human rights, the ability to use Bitcoin without government censorship, without prosecuting developers of open source software, pushing Bitcoin as both a global neutral reserve asset, but also as a peer-to-peer global settlement system. That's our core mission, and see how that interfaces now with these questions about AI, mining, and energy. The good thing about Bitcoin is it's not one thing. It's like 7,000 different things. And so, keeps us busy and entertained inside DC. And so really proud of the work that BPI is doing, the team that we've now assembled. And we're really excited to open up this partnership with Bitkey in DC, essentially a Bitcoin embassy. Hopefully over the summer, we'll be opening that up. Yeah, having events, happy hours, essentially a cultural node downtown for Bitcoiners to congregate, a little bit of a Schelling point, hopefully in progress there. So yeah, really excited, man. Like this year is it's accelerating, and it's fun to kind of help steer what Bitcoin policy might look like in the next few years.
It really is. Get your suits pressed if you're going to DC.
You got to clean up,
Shave. Put on your orange tie. Make it a good orange tie, okay? Don't go to Macy's and buy one off the rack. You gotta get a Hermes. Spend a little dollar. Spend a little money. Get a good orange tie, okay?
Yeah. Buy a ticket. It's like, okay, go to Vegas. You're gonna waste that money on slot machines and bullshit. Save that money. Buy a ticket to the Bitcoin Policy Summit. Do it. Don't be lame.
Matthew, thank you for indulging me in my questions about all these different topics here. Very well versed on all of them. So I really appreciate your time and your relative expertise.
I really don't know what I'm talking about, but
I think you do.
Words.
I think you do.
I'll say words. I'm just the LLM, just auto completing whatever pops into the prefrontal cortex here.
Don't be humble, okay? You know what you're talking about. Yeah, you are. Whatever. Peace and love, freaks.
See ya.
Freaks, thank you for listening to the show. I hope you liked it. If you did like it, please make sure you subscribe, rate, review the show. It helps us out a lot. And also, if you like these conversations, I've come to realize that many people listen to the podcast. They don't know we have another sort of layer of this media company. We have the newsletter, the Bitcoin Brief. Go to tftc.io. Make sure you subscribe there. A lot of the topics that are discussed on this podcast, I write about 5 days a week in the newsletter. We also have the TFTC Elite tier. If you sign up for that, become a member. We have a private Discord server for the elite freaks out there where we're dropping ad-free versions of this show and having discussions about everything we talk about a day early. Logan wanted me to make sure if you want to get the show a day early, become a TFTC Elite member. You will get that. We have our Discord server. Right now it's conversation between myself and TFTC Elite tier members, but we're going to expand that. We'll probably do closed Q&As with people in the industry I may be doing Macro Mondays. So join us. Go to tftc.io. Subscribe. Find the button in the top right corner of the website. Become a TFTC Elite member. Thank you for joining us. Okay.